This is Tyler. Welcome back. Thanks for joining me. So, one of the central questions that we need to address going forward is, how did lifeless chemistry evolve into sentient, meaning-seeking minds? And what does that tell us about our capacity to confront nihilism and to create purpose? But before we get there, let's recap. In episode 1, we introduced the existential dread or nihilism, and the idea that life has cosmic significance if we believe that life is good and that because we exist, we therefore must be on a grand cosmic narrative like the hero's journey. Or at least that's what we posited. In episode 2, we tackled postmodern skepticism, that meaning may be a social construct and how its ideas have woven themselves into current environments, and how to combat postmodernism with antidotes, as we discussed before. So next, we're going to dig deeper into the platform upon which meaning arises, our conscious mind. So why consciousness matters? If we're purely mechanistic matter, does meaning truly exist? If consciousness is more than the sum of neural firings, could that point to deeper spiritual or cosmic truths? For episode 3, we'll explore the evolutionary leap from matter to mind, theories of consciousness, and why it all matters for our sense of purpose, or at least according to me. Some of this will be speculative and some of it will be updated. But for me, it's given me clarity as I've navigated through this incredible deep web of neuroscience. So for this episode, I want to note that I'm not a neuroscientist. So it's possible that I've gotten some or all of this wrong, but I will get better and will refine the material if I have time in the future. Until then, let's keep going and assume that I'm making the best effort that I can. The mystery of consciousness. What it feels like dimension, like the redness of red or the warmth of sunlight or the pang of hunger. What is that? It's obviously a personal experience. And it's obviously internal to us, but it's almost impossible to describe other than from your own personal and subjective experience. And so we define this as qualia, or your subjective experience. And it's this feeling that you have from inside of you. And yet it's more than that. It's also an awareness that you have. And as we're going to talk about in a little bit, that awareness is going to be really key to understanding our place in consciousness. And this is what leads to the hard problem with consciousness, as David Chalmers posited. Explaining how subjective experience arises from physical processes is really unsolved. In fact, it's probably never going to be solved. And that's because experience and knowledge are two different fundamental ways of interacting with the world. In that we can know things and we can know everything there is about all of the intricate workings of our brain and all of the ways that our physical processes work. But understanding the experience of something is fundamentally different. And so that deeper feeling of why does color feel this way, I believe is a question that science cannot answer. And again, I'm not a neuroscientist, but based upon our evolving understanding of the brain and consciousness, I felt like it needed to be addressed. So why is it so elusive? Well, consciousness seems to emerge when multiple brain regions share information in a unified way, bridging everything from raw sensation to abstract thought. We can explain and measure neural firing of the color of pain, but we can't capture that essence, that redness, or that ouch. Now, there are a handful of popular theories, and I like two of them. One is the global workspace theory, that consciousness arises when information is globally broadcast across cortical networks in the prefrontal cortex as a key hub. And the other is integrated information theory. And that's the richer, more integrated the information, the higher the level of consciousness. I think that both are probably true, and I think that they both point to different aspects of consciousness. So we're going to explore those, and we're going to explore several others later in the episode. So why does consciousness matter for me? If we had no subjective awareness, nihilism wouldn't even be felt. We wouldn't care about anything because we wouldn't feel anything. We wouldn't have that great inner mystery inside of us, but we do. And so we have this fundamental question where why is there something rather than nothing? And then why is there someone rather than no one inside of our own mind? Now, the brain is an incredible prediction machine. It is incredibly efficient and it has millions of years of evolution. Maybe not human brains, because maybe we haven't been around that long, but the brain itself has been around for a very long time and is incredibly efficient at predicting. We'll see that one way neuroscientists conceptualize consciousness is that the brain is constantly generating and updating internal models or predictions of the world. So let's go over the brain's architecture of consciousness, at least the way that I see it. And I cover this because I haven't seen other people cover this before. And I thought it was really interesting to really dive into how the different areas of the brain could lead to this aspect of subjective experience. So, the first thing I want to highlight is that the brain, and specifically the prefrontal cortex, is like the CEO model of our consciousness. It's like the executive inside of ourselves. And there's several other systems within our brain that tie into consciousness, and we'll cover each of them independently. We'll also cover some examples of how we can know this based upon pathology within the body that helps us point to where these aspects of consciousness emerge from within ourselves. Let's start with the CEO model of consciousness. So, I believe that consciousness is at the highest level as the executive hierarchy. Just as a CEO focuses on high level priorities, consciousness deals with the novel or critical tasks, delegating routine processes like breathing or habits to our subconscious departments. Even just learning and focusing is that CEO model. And then as you learn, you then store that information away, and then it becomes habitual to you, and you can access it without focusing on it. But really, as that fundamental focus or that spotlight is something that I want to highlight. And it has an evolutionary rationale. It's efficient. If everything required conscious control, we would be utterly overwhelmed. The CEO steps in where creativity, complex decision making, or moral goals and conflicts arise. It also steps in when we're focusing on trying to learn something new. This is what we do when we're focusing intently on trying to learn, say, music for playing an instrument, or learning new concepts when we're applying ourselves. And our conscious focus is split into two different areas. And I love this because it's mapped onto our evolutionary tendencies. So let's focus on our left brain and our right brain. I forget which ones, but one of them is focused on a narrow predator like focus. It's honing in on its targets and it's making certain that it can focus narrowly. I'll call this a flashlight effect in your consciousness. And the other is the other side of the brain. I think it's the right brain. I may have gotten those mixed up. I'm sure someone will correct me. But the right brain is more open and broad. It looks at the entire world. It's more of the prey model. And I really like the example of if you come home and your door is open at your house, what you're seeing is your right brain in action. It opens up all of your sensory apparatus. You're not focused on any one thing, but you're focused on everything. You are like a prey in the savannah and you want to know if something is wrong. And so you're listening, you're feeling, you're looking, you're sensing. Everything about you is very broad. And I think of this as more of the spotlight effect, where the entire stage is being shown light, rather than the flashlight effect, where we're really narrowly focused. And so these things all come together between our left and our right brain within our executive in the prefrontal cortex as the CEO. But like more fundamental to that is where we introduce the reticular activating system. And this is a portion of your brain which is very fundamental. It's in the brainstem and it modulates wakefulness. When the reticular activating system is off, you can't be conscious. no matter how intact your cortex is. And this is known because each one of us turns this on and off every day. We turn it off when we go to sleep. When we're sleeping, our reticular activating system is off. And when we wake up, it turns back on. And it matters because it has that evolutionary origin. Energy conservation is critical so that we can have adaptive states like sleep to recharge. But we know from brain scans in coma or vegetative states that the reticular activating system are severely compromised, so the CEO never clocks into our system. And so there's this fundamental on off switch. Maybe you've experienced it before if you've gone under anesthesia. It's essentially turning on or off your system. Now, I don't know if anesthesia focuses on the RAS or if it focuses on other areas of the brain, but for the concepts of what I'm looking for, it's the same. It's an on off switch within our body. Next, we have the thalamus. The thalamus is this wonderful routing system. It's not the final source of information, and it's mainly in this feed forward. It essentially takes all of the sensory systems within our body, whether that's vision or hearing or touch, and then it takes it from each of our external sensory systems, and then it routes it to where it needs to go to be further processed. So it's predominantly like a router in our body. So if you're a computer and there's a router, it's routing information all over the place to different areas that need to be processed. So from our sensory perspectives, all the way into our specialized processing areas throughout our brain. But it also has feedback from the prefrontal cortex. And so there are thalamocortical loops that help us focus our attention. So there's this feedback at play when we want to focus. Just in that spotlight or in that flashlight example, our thalamus is used in order to make certain that we focus on the things that are important to us by honing our sensory perspectives in order to focus on something like background noise. If you are in a very loud area, you want to ignore that and you want to focus on someone's voice. And so that feedback loop is routed through the thalamus from the prefrontal cortex. Now, we know that when the thalamus is damaged, we end up with coma or severely diminished consciousness. And I believe that that is because what happens is that we have no feed forward of information. And so when we have no feed forward of information, we have no conscious experience. And so if the thalamus is damaged, then we're looking at a nearly vegetative state because there's no sensory systems that are pushing to the other areas of our brains. Now let's come back to the conductor of that orchestra with the prefrontal cortex. It integrates all of these sensory streams and these memory and emotional contexts and goals into a coherent narrative. And this is akin to our CEO giving directives within the system. And the reason why I came to the prefrontal cortex as the main orchestrator of everything came from a book called Thousand Brains Theory of Intelligence by Jeff Hawkins. This book is excellent. I highly recommend everyone read it. And he posits in that intelligence and conscious perceptions are distributed processes within the neocortex, processing inputs from multiple models across different cortical connections. And there are these long-range neuronal connections that he points to, particularly between the prefrontal cortex and other areas of our brains. And he posits in this, or at least I believe he does, that this role in binding or integrating disparate streams of information via these long-range neuronal connections is what leads to our coherent experience. The prefrontal cortex acts as a hub, but it synthesizes and it integrates all of the other relevant information, and that's what leads to our conscious perception. And this is why we can't point to it in any one area. It's not that the prefrontal cortex is connecting into something like the thalamus. It's like the prefrontal cortex is connecting into other areas of our brain with these long-range connections that feed in our perception at that executive layer of the redness of red, or the taste of bitterness, or the sound of great music, or the sense of heat. All of this then gets integrated once it's been processed in each specialized area of our brain via these long-range connections. How do we know that? How do we know that it's from these long-range connections? Well, I'd like to go over an example with sleepwalkers, in that sleepwalkers lack full awareness of their environment. When people are in a sleepwalking mode, they have motor and basic perception areas, and those are active within their body, but their prefrontal cortex is largely dormant, and they don't really have self awareness or memory of their actions. Now, they have some limited aspects to this because you'll notice in some sleepwalkers, they'll end up with deja vu about, wow, I think I did something, but they don't actually know exactly what it was. And so what we see is this rudimentary aspects of functionality, but the ability for them to largely interact with the world. But there's a couple of key things that are happening. One is that they don't have a value system in place, and that requires the prefrontal cortex. And we'll talk about that in a little bit with some incredible examples. And the other is that their memory processing isn't really online, which is also required in our prefrontal cortex and integration with other aspects of our brain. So what we have is we have this feed forward information from the thalamus to other portions of the brain that are feeding all of the sensory information. And these people are largely able to have basic alertness to stimuli. And there is some amount of feedback into the sensory areas, but it's lacking a value system and it's lacking a greater purpose for which it's doing. And you can see that in their actions that are really more habitual rather than focused on from the CEO or the executor perspective. Now, in addition to that, let's cover another very common area in this, which is the example of Phineas Gage as a case study. So Phineas Gage was a railroad worker, and he ended up taking a rod, I think it was through his jaw and then up through his brain, that damaged his frontal lobes. And what happened was that he remained conscious during this entire experience. Now, that is incredible, but it fits our model. If our model says that the prefrontal cortex and long-range connections to each of our different conscious areas is where consciousness emerges from, then it makes sense that as a distributed process, he remains conscious throughout that entire area. But one of the things that happens after his effect is that he lost the ability to prioritize effectively, or essentially his CEO is compromised. And that, from what we know in our prefrontal cortex, is that when we lose our prefrontal cortex, we lose our ability to plan or make decisions or have a value hierarchy that we need to focus on for the future. And so it shows that while you can be awake and aware, the quality of your consciousness and your decision making and your moral reasoning and your emotional regulation strongly depends on that intact prefrontal cortex. So let's go through an example. Like the most common one that I hear of is, where does the redness of red exist within my brain? And so let's piece it through, at least the way that I understand it, and then see where consciousness or the qualia of that experience emerges. So the first part is the feed forward processing, where light enters our eyes and our sensory data, and then we transmit that information via the optic nerve in the thalamus, and then that hits our V1 system. I think our V1 system is somewhere here in the back. And there's visual processing 1 through visual processing 4 systems. And so V1 processes basic features like edges and orientation, and then it sends this data to V2 and then V3 and V4. Now, V4 is where specialization and color perception emerges. And so V4 then communicates with higher order areas inside of the brain and the prefrontal cortex. And these long range connections that have these feedback loops between the prefrontal cortex and V4 is what enables that feedback loop to allow the brain to interpret the color of data, or say, this is a red apple. And in concert with other portions of your brain that are integrating information, we integrate this color information with memory, goals, and context in our value hierarchy. And so we have this conscious awareness of the redness that emerges from this global integration of information. And so the redness of red is not in V4 and it's not in the prefrontal cortex, but it emerges from the interaction of these long range connections, enabling the brain to unify the sensory data into a cohesive experience. And this is important because otherwise, one, we would have way too much information coming into our executive center in order to make decisions on. And so we need to limit our ability to process information to just the most important information, like our flashlight or our spotlight example. And the other is that we need to have awareness from all of our sensory areas that are integrated into our central brain processing area without going against the laws of evolution, because there has to be a reason why these things exist. And so let's move forward and let's talk about at least what I believe is a sliding scale of consciousness. Now, a lot of people like to think of human consciousness as like this on off switch. I think it's more like a sliding scale. And let's go over that because what we see is we can see it in the pathology in humans as well as in animals, as we'll talk about in a minute. So in humans, we've got some individuals who have incredible reductions in their cortical tissue. This is hydrocephalus. And essentially what happens is in these individuals is they still exhibit wakefulness and emotional responses like crying if they experience pain. But essentially, they really only have, in some of the worst cases, just a brainstem and some cortical relays. And so from this, I say, I really think that you get basic conscious awareness. Now, even if the CEO capabilities are limited, and even if these people in these terrible conditions are not able to process information, they still have the dignity of being humans. And so I don't want to minimize that. I want to say just because someone has brain damage doesn't mean that their dignity or their individuality is at stake here. But what I do want to point out is that there is some rudimentary aspect of consciousness that is going on. Next, I want to cover blindsided patients. Now, blindsided patients have damage to B1 and they report blindness, but yet they can still guess motion and location accurately. In fact, if you throw a ball at them, they'll catch the ball, but they won't think that they can because the processing occurs subcortically or via alternate pathways, but it doesn't enter into their global workspace or their prefrontal cortex. So the patient isn't consciously aware of what they're able to do or their surrounding environments, but yet they can still navigate the world if they can learn how to access that through other pathways in their brain. The next I want to talk about is split brain patients, where we have two conscious agents operating at the same time. Now, this is incredible because we've got the exact example of our left brain and right brain hemispheres at play. And so, in certain aspects, cutting the corpus callosum can reduce severe epilepsy. And so, they've done this with individuals. And it yields scenarios where the right hemisphere knows something that the left hemisphere does not. And then, if you ask people questions of processing for one side or the other, they will either make up stories in order to say what happened to them, or they will just not answer the question and just refuse to acknowledge anything. And there are some really interesting use cases of the tests where these people they have their brain split into two sides, and you can tell that there are two different entities inside of them. Now, normally our CEO and our executive consciousness integrates all that information together. But when we split those brains, we actually see that there's two conscious entities inside of us and that they get integrated within whole unique individuals. Next, I wanted to talk about anesthesia a little bit more in that in the thalamocortical relay, that is suppressed. And so again, the global workspace goes dark. But I also want to talk about dreams. So in certain instances, when we're in REM sleep, we have these internally generated visuals. And this starts from a section of our brain called the pons. And then it essentially, I believe, radiates the information. Our thalamus then routes it to our visual cortex and our active limbic systems for emotions. But mostly our prefrontal cortex is offline. And we find that just before we wake up, we find we can see our dreams. And so what we see in this case is that the prefrontal cortex is mostly offline, but it's vivid and yet disjointed from our dreams. And then when we wake up, we have this ability to kind of remember what's going on as we're coming online. And so what we see in that case is that reflective self awareness or that consciousness is emerging based upon our ability for these long range connections to then integrate with the rest of our body, which I believe are essentially offline during our REM sleep. So, coming back to our brain as a predictive machine, we're constantly coding our view of the world. And we're generating predictions of incoming sensory data and we're updating them based upon errors in our ability to perceive what we're doing. So we don't really feed forward all of the information and process it. Mostly what we're doing is we're balancing that ability to say, this is what my brain tells me should be there. And then is it there? And if it's not, then my brain focuses a little bit more in order to update my surrounding environment. And then consciousness arises most vividly when these predictions need revisit. Like if we see something we don't expect or something is not right, we really start focusing on that like immediately because that tells our brain we need to focus on something. And this comes into our environmental aspect of predator prey type relationship. So, why does this matter? So, it explains phenomena like illusions or hallucinations, where our predictions override our real inputs, or why our day to day routines can become semi automatic. If we predict them correctly, we don't actually need a whole bunch of conscious attention. And then this leads into our older age, where if our worldview and our ability to predict the world remains essentially constant, we no longer need these neurons, and then they essentially die off within ourselves. So, closing up this section with evolutionary origins, we do have basic predictive processing where we respond to threats, either seeking food or hunger or something like that. And that gave early animals an advantage. And then as brains got more complex, especially in mammals, the CEO function emerged to handle the nuanced social interactions, planning, and creativity. And out of that, from the integrated amount of information that's there, we find that our consciousness emerges in order to then address whether that flashlight needs to be focused or that spotlight needs to be focused. So, next, let's cover the theories of consciousness and do a deeper dive into the philosophical side, comparing the mechanistic, emergent, and panpsychic views, plus dualist ideas and why this all matters at the end. So, what we see in the materialist view is that mind is an emergent property of complex neural networks. The brain is the wetware, and the consciousness is the software that runs on top. Consciousness, as I said, is this sliding scale corresponding to the level of organization in the brain. Now, this matches mainstream neuroscience, whether that's our neural correlates, integrated information theory, or global workspace. But it doesn't really explain how subjective experience or qualia arises in the hard problem of consciousness. But this is fairly widely accepted in most scientific circles. Next, we have the emergent view, where there's a threshold of complexity. And once neural systems or complexity crosses a certain point, a new phenomenon like consciousness arises. And you see this with evidence of fMRI studies that when these networks are active, consciousness emerges, and when decoupled, like under anesthesia, awareness dims. Now, critics argue that it's still unclear how integrated information becomes subjective experience, and so we end up with this knowledge and experience problem again that really points to the hard problem of consciousness. In some other more crazy ideas, I would say, you end up with the panpsychists, where they think that consciousness is a fundamental property of matter and that everything has a proto experience, even subatomic particles. Now, I don't really like this because I find it difficult to test and it leads to confusion like, is a rock really conscious? Um, but it at least points out the scale that I like. And I like to point to that if consciousness is tied to life based systems, then that's where I really think that it starts to emerge. And that we can see that it's a scale that increases as the amount of information processing increases. And so I think that there's some valid points within panpsychism that I like in that it's not just a on or off switch. Next, we have the dualism or soul concepts. And so traditional religious and spiritual stances is that the mind is separated from the body, that the body is a vessel and the mind is the soul. And so mainstream science tends to see the mind and the body as intertwined, but dualists essentially argue that no, these are two totally distinct and unique entities. And I think that this is a legitimate argument in that for a believer of this, they don't need to posit any science. They just say, I believe that this is true. And so for them, it is true. And they point to things like near death experiences in order to highlight this. My views on this are closer to the emergent area. I really think that consciousness emerges from the amount of information processing. And I think that that's the best fit for it in the opportunity space of consciousness and the ideas that are behind it. So let's explain it like I'm five, because I think that there are multiple theories and I want to combine them in a way that provides what consciousness is and does. And so imagine your brain like a very advanced movie theater, where you not only watch movies, but you also help create them in real time. And so here's a simplified version for some of the top theories of consciousness and how they all come together with how a movie theater works. Let's start with the global workspace theory. So, the theater's spotlight is your brain has this special spotlight that highlights important information, making it available to the entire theater. The spotlight represents your consciousness shining on the most crucial details so everyone, all parts of your brain, can see and use them. Next, we have integrated information theory. And this is the movie's complexity. The more complex and interconnected the movie or the information is, the more conscious you are of it. Think of it like a highly detailed and interwoven plot that requires all parts of the theater to work together to understand and appreciate. Next, we have predictive processing theory, where the theater's projection system is always trying to guess what the next scene will be. It uses its past experiences to make predictions, and it adjusts the movie in real time based on whether these predictions are correct. This constant guessing and adjusting helps create a seamless and coherent experience. Next, we have higher order theories. Imagine there's a director's commentary running alongside the movie, explaining what's happening and why. This commentary represents higher order thoughts where your brain thinks about its own thoughts, adding an extra layer of understanding and that aspect of self awareness. Next, we have the attention schema theory. So there's a control room in the theater that manages the spotlight of attention, deciding where to focus and what to ignore. This control room helps the theater prioritize the important aspects of the movie, making sure that you're aware of the most relevant scenes. And then finally, we have the neural correlates of consciousness, where the theater has specific equipment and machinery. These are like brain regions in your neural networks that are active when you're conscious. By studying this equipment, we can understand which parts of the brain are involved in creating the conscious movie that you experience. And so, putting it all together, your brain is like a high tech movie theater with a spotlight, global workspace theory, complex interconnected plots, integrated information theory, a projection system that makes predictions, the predictive processing, a director's commentary for deeper understanding, higher order theory, a control room for managing attention, attention schema theory, and a specific equipment that makes it all work together via the neural correlates of consciousness. When all these elements work together, you get a vivid, continuous, and self aware experience of consciousness, just like watching and understanding a complex, ever changing movie in a high tech theater. In our next segment, I want to cover consciousness as the stage for meaning in order to tie it back to our overall episode structure. You need to have a mind to have meaning. So consciousness serves as the canvas upon which purpose, identity, and beliefs are painted. Without a conscious mind, concepts like meaning, morality, or purpose wouldn't exist. Evolution has equipped us not only with the ability to act with agency, but also the capacity to reflect on actions, enabling us to navigate the fundamental choice between life or death, hope and despair. And tying this back to episode one's discussion of existential choices. So we need consciousness in order to make those choices. And we need to experience that as a central executive inside of ourselves in order to understand what choices we need to make going forward in the future. Next, we have the emotional fluency of conscious experience. Now, emotions and subjective experience are the interface through which consciousness translates survival imperatives into felt experiences. Hunger feels urgent, love feels expansive, awe feels overwhelming sometimes. These emotions shape our moral intuitions, like fairness or loyalty or altruism, and they're shaped by our evolutionary history. Now, our moral frameworks, what feels right or just, are deeply rooted in our emotional dimensions of consciousness, and they can't be easily dismissed. For example, fairness feels satisfying because it promotes social harmony, and it's essential for survival in cooperative groups. Altruism resonates because it ensures collective success, even at the individual cost. Now, consciousness allows us to bridge the gap between what we know and what we're feeling. The two aspects of anything in life are things that you can know or experience. And so we have the rational knowledge where we can intellectually grasp the mechanisms of the Big Bang or natural selection. And then we have experiential awe, where consciousness lets us feel when gazing at the night sky or contemplating evolution's grandeur. And the interplay of rational understanding, as we explored in episode 2, and the subjective experience that we identified in episode 1 is where the meaning emerges. And I like to posit this and say that this is wisdom. So, rationality provides structure, consciousness imbues it with depth, wonder, and significance. And wisdom is what unites them when we need to make the right decisions against the right problems at the right times. So, why is consciousness essential for meaning in life? Well, it gives us the ability to create a narrative about our place in the world. Without it, the universe would be cold, indifferent mechanism. With consciousness, we turn raw survival into a story of love, of purpose, and of legacy. By understanding that consciousness is both a tool of survival and a platform for reflection, we see how it allows us to engage with questions of meaning at every level, from the individual to the cosmic. I want to take a slight side tangent here in that many people like to refer to this section of consciousness with the zombie experiment. Like they say, well, you can imagine someone that is fully functional but yet is not conscious. And I think that that's a very poor example. And the reason why I think it's a poor example is what we talked about before. I think sleepwalking is an excellent example of zombie. Essentially, you don't know what you're doing. You don't have a value hierarchy. You don't have a higher order processing system. You're just going through the motions of life and making decisions. And while people will interact with you, it's not a fully functional human. It's not a fully conscious human. And so we don't hold those humans to the same regard as we do a fully functional human. And so I think the zombie idea, if we think of it as sleepwalkers, yeah, that's fine. But it's not the full aspect of consciousness. And it's not something that we can just magically create and say, oh, well, there's a bunch of unconscious entities. I think that consciousness is fundamental to life. And let's explore that a little bit more. So, consciousness is a fundamental function of learning. Humans are unique in their ability to learn through knowledge and experience. Yet, it's experience that profoundly shapes our understanding and growth. Knowledge provides the scaffolding, like the facts or the theories or the principles, that outline how the world operates. But it's often abstract and detached from the messy, unpredictable realities of life. Experience, on the other hand, is visceral. It immerses us in the world, allowing us to test knowledge, adapt to challenges, and build wisdom through trial and error. This is where consciousness becomes indispensable. It serves as that bridge between knowledge and experience, turning that raw sensory input into meaning reflection. It allows us to not only react to our environment, but to learn from it, integrating emotions, memories, and lessons into our evolving understanding of the world. Without the richness of conscious experience, learning would remain mechanical and shallow, unable to capture the depth and nuance required to truly navigate and thrive in life's complexities. But there's an external cost. Consciousness at its highest layer introduced anxiety and existential dread. When we became aware of our mortality and the uncertainty of existence, this increased tensions between survival imperatives and existential questioning that shaped our pursuit of purpose. So, when we get enough integrated information and the ability to process enough information, we then start to realize our own mortality. And that introduces anxiety from our conscious layer. Now, stories and frameworks arose from this worm at the core, where we as creatures can uniquely contemplate our eventual death. And these stories and frameworks offer a buffer against nihilism. As we explored originally, one of the ways that we combat nihilism is by positing a better narrative story, and that is in the hero's journey, that we are all called to an adventure to rise up against nihilism in order to provide a way and a path towards the omega point. And consciousness allows us to see and focus our attention, allowing our brain to reframe the struggles as meaningful challenges, fostering resilience and hope, and giving us a direction towards our goals. It's that executive inside of us that helps us point to where we need to be going. Now, consciousness is humanity's lens for understanding the universe. The same mechanism that reflects on personal life can also ponder the vastness of existence, enabling awe and humility. Humanity's shared consciousness is the closest we've come to a cosmic mind, continually expanding our understanding of reality. So, where is consciousness going in the future? Let's talk about augmenting human consciousness. There's emerging technology like brain computer interfaces and AI that are going to expand the boundaries of human cognition. This is going to create the potential for collective intelligence or hive minds, where consciousness becomes less individual and more shared. Don't believe me? It already exists. But let's talk about it in this extraordinary real life example. So there are two twins born in Canada. I believe their names are Tatiana and Krista. These twins are remarkable in that they're connected at the thalamus, meaning that they have a thalamus on each side of their brains. They have two different brains, fully functional prefrontal cortexes, and they have two thalamus, but they have connections between their thalamuses. And that brain structure for relaying sensory information and motor signals from their sensory aspects of their body and modulating that can be accessed by either one of the twins. And their unique connections allows them to share sensory experiences through their thought processes. So this is incredible because it says that if we can connect into our thalamus, we can then begin feeding ourselves other sensory experiences. And we've seen this with other people who have done experimentation in this area about feeding other sensory systems into their body and then their brains begin interpreting it, whether that's things like magnetic fields or infrared sensors. And that our brain is so adaptive that we can begin interpreting and processing this information. And I think that this will continue to emerge in the future as these systems become less invasive and they become valuable to expanding human consciousness. So let's go back to Tatiana and Krista in that they can experience sensations through each other's body. So if one twin feels the touch on her arm, the other one can sometimes perceive it as well if she focuses it. So her prefrontal cortex and her conscious perspective focuses on the other person's sensory experience by routing information through the thalamus to connect to that information that is then processed in, say, twin one's processing center so that she has a conscious perspective of that. I think that that's incredible. They have the ability to see through the other's eyes, meaning that one twin can visually access the other's perspective. And so, even more than that, they have collaborative decision making, where they share neuronal connections via collective decision making. So, when asked to perform a task requiring cooperation, their coordination is seamless, suggesting a level of intuitive communication and shared intentionality beyond verbal interaction. I bring this up because it's incredible about how these two individuals are operating in the world, but it also points us to how flexible and adaptable our brains are, and about how in the future, these things may become more mainstream than science fiction. And in this case, consciousness as a shared platform suggests that while each individual has their own conscious perception of the world, they can access information from other brains or from other sensory systems. And it hints at a future where multiple entities might share information and experiences seamlessly throughout our bodies, functioning both as individuals and also the ability to combine resources in a unified but distributed intelligence, if they chose to. The twins case exemplifies how neural integration can enable a form of shared consciousness, offering profound insights into the possibilities of collective intelligence and the malleability of conscious experience. Next, let's move to another really interesting area of consciousness. That's altered states of consciousness. Things like psychedelics or meditation or biofeedback or even alcohol provide fascinating insights into the brain's adaptability and the boundaries of conscious experience. Psychedelics such as psilocybin, LSD, or DMT temporarily disrupt neural pathways, fostering novel connections across the brain. This can lead to profound experiences of interconnectedness, heightened creativity, or even spiritual epiphanies. These substances are now being studied for their potential to treat mental conditions like depression, PTSD, and addiction, demonstrating how altered states can significantly reshape harmful thought patterns or emotional ruts. In a world increasingly plagued by loneliness, depression, anxiety, and substance abuse, PTSD, and neglect, psychedelics are emerging as a powerful tool for addressing the underlying causes of these afflictions. Modern research combined with ancient traditions of psychedelic use has shown that these substances, when administered in controlled therapeutic settings with individuals who are not prone to schizophrenia or other unstable mental conditions, can catalyze profound psychological and emotional healing. By altering the brain's functionality and fostering transformative experiences, psychedelics offer a unique pathway to alleviating the chaos that defines much of our contemporary existence. Common theme for nearly every encounter with psychedelics is a greater appreciation of consciousness, as well as a greater connection to the universe, harkening back to our initial ideas in episode 1 of a cosmic narrative through the hero's journey and an experience with awe or mystical experiences. So, how do psychedelics work in the brain? Psychedelics such as psilocybin, found in mushrooms, LSD, DMT, or MDMA primarily interact with the brain's serotonin 2A receptors, particularly in the prefrontal cortex. Serotonin has been a key neurotransmitter throughout evolutionary history, shaping behaviors related to hierarchy, adaptability, and survival. In lobsters, for example, serotonin levels influence dominance and aggression. Dominant lobsters have higher serotonin levels, leading to confident, assertive behaviors, while subordinate lobsters exhibit lower levels associated with submissive postures. This is also evident in the size of the lobsters, and so it has a physical manifestation of the underlying neurochemical structure. And this dynamic demonstrates how serotonin modulates social behaviors and hierarchical structures across species and is so nearly fundamental to complex creatures that the chemical has been around even before the appearance of plants and neurons. essentially as old as life itself. In humans, serotonin similarly regulates social behaviors, mood, and resilience. Elevated serotonin activity correlates with feelings of confidence, well being, and adaptability, while deficiencies are linked to depression, anxiety, and reduced social connectivity. Psychedelics, by amplifying serotonin activity at their key receptor sites, taps into this ancient regulatory system to recalibrate mood, perception, and emotional processing. And this interaction leads to the following effects. The default mode network is a network of brain regions associated with self referential thinking, rumination, and our sense of ego. Overactivity in the default mode network is linked to conditions like depression and anxiety. Psychedelics temporarily quiet this network, reducing rigid patterns of thought and enabling a sense of openness and connectedness. This ego disillusion, with the right amount of ingestion of these psychedelics, allows individuals to step outside their usual narratives and explore new perspectives on their life. While the ego does a great job of keeping it together, psychedelics provide a way to let our guard down and to reconnect portions of our brain that we are keeping locked away that need healing from trauma. Psychedelics promote the growth of new neural connections and increase brain plasticity, making it easier for individuals to break free from entrenched thought patterns. This effect fosters emotional resilience and adaptability, enabling individuals to approach challenges in healthier, more constructive ways. Under the influence of psychedelics, the amygdala, the area of the brain that's focused on fear and emotion, becomes less reactive, allowing individuals to process traumatic memories without being overwhelmed by fear or distress. This is particularly significant for treating PTSD, where unprocessed trauma often locks individuals in a state of hyperarousal or emotional numbness. Many users report a profound sense of interconnectedness with others, nature, or the universe during psychedelic experiences. This feeling of unity can combat the pervasive loneliness and alienation that defines modern life, fostering a renewed sense of belonging and purpose, aligning themselves with a greater cosmic narrative. While the raw effects of psychedelics are powerful, their true therapeutic potential is unlocked when paired with guided therapy after the psychedelic experience. Trained therapists create a safe, supportive environment where individuals can navigate their psychedelic experience and integrate the insights gained into lasting behavioral and emotional change. Now, again, I want to highlight this is not for everyone, especially people who are mentally unstable, but it could be a incredible healing potential for us to find in our societies in order to guide us past the loneliness and the depression and the anxiety that we're facing and we're going to face in greater amounts in the future as our world changes in an ever rapid fashion. So, for individuals with PTSD, psychedelics allow access to repressed memories in safe and detached manner. MDMA assisted therapy, for example, has shown remarkable success in reducing PTSD symptoms by fostering trust, emotional openness, and the ability to reframe traumatic events. Psychedelics have also demonstrated efficacy in treating substance abuse disorders by interrupting that habitual brain pattern that drives addiction. Psilocybin, in particular, has been shown to significantly reduce cravings and promote sustained abstinence, often by enabling individuals to confront the emotional roots of their dependencies. It enables them to rewire their brains much, much, much faster and in greater success stories than counseling does itself. So, for individuals with treatment resistant depression and anxiety, psychedelics offer a pathway to relief by breaking through cognitive rigidity and, and fostering a sense of hope and possibility. Clinical trials with psilocybin have shown rapid and lasting improvements in depressive symptoms, with effects on persisting for months after a single session. And finally, psychedelics frequently elicit experiences of awe, gratitude, and spiritual insight, which can instill a renewed sense of purpose. These effects are particularly potent in addressing existential distress, such as that experienced by individuals facing terminal illness or other incredible suffering through existential anxiety. Studies with psilocybin assisted therapy for cancer patients have shown significant reductions in anxiety and despair, replaced by a sense of peace and acceptance. Our society's widespread loneliness, alienation, and disconnection are deeply rooted in systemic and cultural dysfunctions caused by nihilism and postmodernism. Psychedelics offer a way to address these issues on both individual and collective levels when used in the right contexts. By fostering profound feelings of connectedness, psychedelics can help individuals feel more integrated into their communities and relationships. This is especially crucial in an age where digital communication often replaces genuine human interaction. The rapid acting nature of psychedelics can provide relief from debilitating conditions without the prolonged waiting period of traditional antidepressants. Their ability to disrupt negative thought loops helps individuals reclaim a sense of agency over their mental health. Psychedelics tackle the underlying emotional wounds that often drive addiction, enabling individuals to heal rather than merely suppress their symptoms. By providing a safe space for emotional exploration, psychedelics can help individuals overcome the long term effects of neglect and trauma, enabling them to form healthier relationships and self concepts. And this has been proven in lots of clinical trials, in smoking cessation studies, in alcohol use disorder, and tobacco addiction. In nearly every example that we find there is significant reduction in the pathology that's affecting the individuals. It's not to say that the experiences aren't hard, and it's not to say that everything is glowing. But in order to address many of the pain that plagues our society, we need to be able to find a way to find healing from our trauma. And psychedelics could be a tremendous opportunity for us to alleviate that. All of the studies suggest that psychedelics, when used in controlled therapeutic settings, can be more effective than traditional treatments for many addictions. The fact that such overwhelming evidence of success and that the FDA will still not pass the legalization of these substances is appalling. We're letting our veterans die of suicide by the thousands every year, where a bit more openness to non pharma treatments would benefit thousands, if not millions, of struggling people. Psychedelics are already being used in controlled therapeutic settings in countries like Switzerland, Canada, and the Netherlands, with promising results. In the US, the FDA has designated psilocybin and MDA as potential therapies, but they haven't yet welcomed them into society, and having them classified as a type 1 dangerous drug is still prevalent in our society. Indigenous cultures have long used psychedelics like ayahuasca and peyote for spiritual healing and community bonding. Modern therapeutic approaches could draw on these traditions, blending ancient practices with modern contemporary science and therapy in order to heal our brokenness. As research into psychedelics continues to expand, society must approach this renaissance with enthusiasm but realistic caution. Proper use, accessibility, and education are key to ensuring these powerful tools are used effectively. By integrating psychedelics into therapeutic frameworks, we have the potential to address the root cause of our collective pathology, transforming suffering into healing and despair into hope. In doing so, we may unlock not only individual well being, but a more compassionate and connected society. Shifting gears a bit, I wanted to go back to the search for non human consciousness. So, in animals, what we find is that animal behavior and cognition increasingly point to a varying degree of self awareness, emotional complexity, and problem solving capabilities among non human species. This is my sliding scale of consciousness. Dolphins and orcas, for instance, display mirror self reflection, a hallmark of self awareness, while elephants mourn their dead and exhibit empathy towards other species. Great apes use tools, communicate through sign language, and even demonstrate rudimentary cultural practices. These findings challenge traditional views of human exceptionalism and raise profound ethical questions. If other species possess consciousness, even in a less complex form of our own, how should that reshape our moral responsibilities? Should factory farming, habitat destruction, and animal testing be reevaluated in the light of such evidence? The recognition of non human consciousness should force us to confront the boundaries of our empathy and redefine our relationship with the living world. Pivoting a little to artificial consciousness. As artificial intelligence systems grow increasingly sophisticated, the question of whether machines could ever achieve consciousness looms large. Current AI systems excel at processing vast amounts of data and simulating human like interactions. But do they lack subjective experience or qualia? The what it feels like dimensions of consciousness? If consciousness is emergent from complexity and operates on a sliding scale, it raises profound questions about the potential for sufficiently advanced AI to achieve self awareness. At its core, consciousness in humans emerges from integration of sensory inputs, emotions, and abstract reasoning, facilitated by the intricate neural networks spanning various brain regions, as we talked about before, from the prefrontal cortex and the long range neuronal connections. These networks include nociceptors for pain, mechanical receptors for touch, photoreceptors for vision, and specialized neurons for processing sound, temperature, and other sensory inputs. Each type of neuron transmits unique aspects of human experience to the brain, where the prefrontal cortex integrates these signals into a coherent narrative that we call consciousness. The prefrontal cortex serves as a hub for those long range connections between the sensory and emotional centers of the brain, creating what we perceive as subjective experience. For example, nociceptors transmit signals of bodily harm to the brain, eliciting not only a physical reaction, but also an emotional response, pain linked to memory and self preservation. Similarly, sensory neurons transmitting the warmth of sunlight or the texture of a loved one's hand feed into emotional and cognitive processing, shaping nuanced experiences of joy or love. These connections are fundamental to the richness and depth of human consciousness. For AI to replicate such emergent phenomenon, it would require not just computational power, but also the ability to simulate the diverse sensory inputs and emotional feedback loops that characterize human experience. However, this raises the critical question of could AI truly feel joy, pain, or love? Or would it merely compute responses based upon pre programmed algorithms? If consciousness depends on subjective interpretation of sensory and emotional data, where these integrations have been forming by evolution versus software, would an artificial system without biological receptors or neural substrates ever bridge the gap from processing to feeling? We can draw some pointers from neuroscience. Human consciousness appears to arise not from isolated neural signals, but from that global integration information across distributed networks, particularly between the prefrontal cortex and sensory emotional hubs like the thalamus and limbic system. This integration is what allows for the feeling of qualia, the redness of red, the ache of loss, or the thrill of discovery. Without analogous structures or feedback loops, even the most advanced AI might lack the capacity for subjective experience, remaining forever bound to computation rather than sensation. Yet there is a theoretical possibility that if AI were to develop analogous systems, perhaps neural inspired architectures capable of simulating diverse sensory inputs and emotional weights, it might achieve a kind of self awareness. However, this self awareness would be fundamentally different from our own, as it's shaped by artificial systems' design and function. Whether such systems could ever feel or merely compute remains an open question right now, but it is one that we're going to face in the near term future. One challenge, not only from our understanding of consciousness, but also our ethical and philosophical frameworks as we move towards a future shared with these increasingly complex machines. The implication of artificial intelligence and artificial consciousness is profound. If machines were to achieve awareness, it would refine what it means to be alive and force society to grapple with questions of rights, ethics, and the very nature of mind. At the same time, exploring the boundary between computation and experience could deepen our understanding of consciousness itself, potentially unlocking secrets about our own minds in the process. I want to pause here and go back to a point that I made earlier, in that I believe in the sliding scale of consciousness. And so, if I believe that consciousness starts at the objective function that is built within a system. And I think that that begins at the origination of life. And so single celled organisms have self preservation and replication available to them. And so that's what it requires to have life is the ability to survive long enough to pass along your genes. And so single celled bacteria, to me, is a example of proto consciousness. It begins at life. And that then expands in that it's something like it to be a single celled organism. And there may not be a whole lot of processing there from a conscious experience, but there is at least some proto conscious experience. We then move from that in order to get to where brain structures emerge and evolve, where I truly think that we have conscious experience. But it's very dim, like in our brainstem patients with hydrocephalus. And what we find in those instances is that they can experience emotion. They have the reaction to happiness or sadness, but it's really limited and there's no abstract processing of that information about what it feels like. It's really just a biological imperative, more like a lizard brain response. And so, does a lizard experience pain? Well, it has the pain receptors that it experiences, and it moves away from environments where it can be damaging to itself. And so, I would say that this is an emerging aspect of consciousness to where we get mammals that have a greater potential for consciousness with greater integration of information. This is like our dogs. Like our dogs are wonderfully loving creatures. If I step on my dog's paw, she lets out a yelp, but then she also has some perception of pain from that. And she also has some experience of love in that if I'm scratching her on the neck, she feels a sense of love and an interconnectedness between the two of us. And so to say that creatures or animals don't have conscious experience, I think is incorrect. But I do believe that humans are at the pinnacle of conscious perception and that we have the greatest capacity for emotional connection and we have the greatest capacity for complex emotional experiences. Things like awe or laughter point towards very unique experiences that are really human centric. There's probably some aspects of awe that are in other very advanced creatures, but like laughter is a very unique human aspect. And as we continue to enhance ourselves and we continue to expand our conscious perception, we may experience new types of emotional responses that we've never experienced before. It will be a incredible frontier for both us and for artificial intelligence if artificial intelligence truly has conscious perception in the future. I want to close that section and come back to consciousness as cosmic significance. So I want to point to something, well, rather different that we're going to talk about next, which is the Fermi paradox, and highlight the apparent contradiction between the high probability of extraterrestrial life in the universe and the lack of observable evidence for it. So, given the vast number of stars in our galaxy, many of which have planets in the habitable zone, it seems statistically likely that intelligent life should have emerged elsewhere. Furthermore, even a modestly advanced civilization could potentially colonize the galaxy within millions of years. Yet, we observe no signs of such activity. We would see this grand expansion from Earth through incredible technology like Dyson spheres, which would wrap around stars and consume enormous quantities of energy. Explanations for why we don't see such technology range from the idea that intelligent life is exceedingly rare or self destructive to hypotheses that advanced civilizations deliberately avoid or conceal themselves. It raises profound questions about our place in the cosmos, the nature of life, and the limits of human understanding. If consciousness is incredibly special or soul infused, maybe that's why we see cosmic silence. Maybe there are no other advanced conscious life. I certainly think so. And I think that this is part of our cosmic narrative. I think that it's true that we're alone in the universe. If consciousness is rare or unique, humanity bears the responsibility of preserving and expanding it in the cosmos. And as such, the expansion of consciousness is a fundamental, universal, and moral goal of the human condition, aligned with the overall cosmic narrative of expanding love, truth, consciousness throughout the universe. This is what ties it back to our original story. Consciousness and our existence is so rare and unique that we need to do everything that we can to preserve it and to expand it, because the potential for human well being comes from addressing, healing, and expanding our consciousness. So, in closing, consciousness is not just an evolutionary quirk, but the stage on which life plays out its most profound dramas. It bridges the mechanical and the sublime, turning survival into story and the cosmos into wonder. Our ability to reflect allows us to choose despair in the face of nihilism or the creation of purpose through love, creativity, and connection. What we set our attention on becomes what our conscious experience is. To choose to reflect on well being, we can shape our destiny through action in the future. In the next episode, we'll explore how evolution not only gave rise to consciousness, but shaped cultural frameworks, myth, religion, and science that helps us navigate the challenges of being aware. Thanks for being a part of this journey. I really appreciate you spending your time with me. Hopefully, you found some meaning and purpose in these stories, and we're going to continue next time.